In my experience, there are three major errors that the academic writers make that in themselves cause a lot of other errors afterwards. And the first one is forgetting that you're actually taking part in a conversation. And the second one is forgetting the relationship between asking a question and answering it. And the third one is treating every writing session like a performance rather than work. When you forget that writing is a conversation, what happens is that you give it no context. When you just write about your research, you just write exactly what happened and the reader sits there and looks at it saying, so what? Why are you telling me this? You need to have, by putting it in a conversation, you give it a background and you give it a meaning and you place it in relation to what other people have written instead of it just being an isolated piece of knowledge. The second thing that happens when you forget it's a conversation is that you end up just writing to your computer. People look at their computer and ask themselves, well, is this introduction long enough? And it doesn't matter. It's not the length that matters. What matters is who's going to be reading it at the other end. For some people, you might have to explain a lot. For other people, you might not have to explain so much. But just looking at your computer as you write just doesn't give you a sense of somebody at the other end reading that and absorbing that information. The second big mistake is forgetting that what you're doing is essentially asking a question and answering it. And these two things have to have some relationship with one another. One of the things I see a lot is that people don't actually have a question. They just have a topic, and it's very difficult to structure a paper that's based on a topic. You just explain everything you know, and after a certain point, when you've been researching things for a while, you know so much that it's very hard to get this lion into a little cage. The second thing that happens is that you ask more than you can possibly answer. You ask a really broad question. What is the cause of war, for example? And it's impossible to answer that in the kind of short writing that journal articles tend to be. So what happens is that the reader ends up feeling unfulfilled, like you didn't really answer the question that you promised to ask. The third thing that happens is that you answer more than you asked, which is when you are studying things and you find out a lot of stuff that's interesting and you answer your question as you promised, but then you start adding a lot of other stuff that is, it's interesting in itself, but the reader's looking at this and asking, why are you telling me this? This is not what I signed on for. It doesn't answer the question that you asked at the beginning. And the fourth thing that happens, and the thing that I actually see most often, is that you end up asking a different question than the one that you answer. And this happens because of something I call intellectual drift. When you start writing, you understand you're writing more and more as you keep writing, and then pretty soon by the time you finish, you end up in a completely different place than you started, which is fine. It represents the maturing of your thinking, but it means you have to go back and change that question so that the reader understands what it is we will be talking about. The third thing that can go wrong is that you treat every single writing session as a performance. And if you've ever played a musical instrument or ever been on some sort of sports team, you know that in order to get good, you have to do things over and over again. And yet people know this, but they sit down in front of their computer and they think every word that they write has to be perfect right then and there. And what happens is they get this paralyzing perfectionism that means that they can't write anything at all. They just sit there and they can't even think through an idea before they've already censored it themselves. And most writing is rewriting, so you have to have something on paper before you can get further with that. And that means treating writing not as performance, but just as work. You get there, you write, and you go home.